Hello and welcome to this webinar about threat analysis and risk assessment. If you don't know anything about us, Ictech is a consultant company in Gothenburg and in Linköping, and we work with the software development and provide consulting services. Oh, I'm going to shut down my sound here, sorry. Perfect. As I said, we work with software development and we provide consulting services in basically all area of the development process. And one of the areas we work with is cybersecurity. And today we're going to share our knowledge about cybersecurity and threat analysis and risk assessment. And if you have any questions during the webinar, just write them down in the question section here on YouTube, and we will answer them during and after the presentation. And our host is you, Anders Ranheim. He is Ictech's technical officer.
Okay, thank you, Matilda. Okay, let's start. So once again, welcome to this webinar. Threat analysis and risk assessment is the topic. I will be saying the phrase or the acronym TARA from now on. Makes everything easier. I'll also start with, before we get into the material, just some general comments. So begin with, what is TARA on a slogan level? TARA is a method to systematically identify and assess cybersecurity threats. Cybersecurity threats related to a vehicle function or components or functions in a vehicle. That's on a very high level. And the purpose of doing such a TARA is then to be able to make an informed decision basically about how to handle such cybersecurity threats. Like to avoid the threat or to reduce it, and to what extent, or maybe even to accept the threat. And the purpose of this presentation here today is primarily to show how a TARA analysis is performed. And I'll do that in quite some detail. Also, TARA is introduced and described and documented in an ISO standard, which has a number 21434. This ISO standard was released middle of last year. This ISO standard has a lot more than it has a lot more than the TARA. I think TARA is something like 2 out of altogether 15 chapters. So there's much more in this ISO standard, but there it is. And I would also like to say that everything I present here today can basically be found in the document, the 21434, but in a format which is maybe not so easy to digest. ISO standard has that characteristic, one could say. So I hope that this webinar will make everything clear, how all the pieces fit together. So let's get into the layout and the organization of this presentation. I'll start with, quite briefly, to say some words about why cybersecurity for vehicles is meaningful to talk about. So basically give some context, and then we will get into the how, which is, I think, probably 90% of this presentation, where I will, on a high level, show the TARA process, and then we'll get into some examples to cover all the details, basically. And after that, we'll end with some final words related to some other things that relate to TARAs, and then we'll end with a Q&A. We might also take some questions along the way. I will be Matilda will tell me if there are any like questions that we need to be taken along the way. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, I think you probably all heard the cliche that a modern car is a computer on wheels. I claim that this is more than a cliche. I mean, given the fact that a modern vehicle contains dozens, if not upwards of 100, 150, maybe 200 small computing units, or actually nowadays sometimes one or two quite big computing units actually, with lots and lots of software on them. I think like more than 80% of the innovation in the vehicle industry happens in the software domain, or the software electronics domain. These are all connected together, and these modern cars are also, of course, connected to the internet. They also have other external interfaces like Bluetooth, USB, charging ports, NFC, and so on. So altogether, it's reasonable to say that the vehicle industry nowadays must be at least as concerned about cybersecurity as is the case in the IT industry. In addition, of course, a car has, it has the attribute that somebody can actually get seriously hurt or killed if something bad happens. So this is something that the vehicle industry really needs to take seriously. I've just listed some examples of a poll that was carried out last year by Synopsys, and without going into the specific numbers here, what it basically says is that in the industry there is a lack of skill, there is a lack of competence, there is too little testing, and it is really challenging for many to raise these kinds of concerns regarding cybersecurity up the corporate ladder. And the reason is, of course, as always, time plans are tight, budget is tight. We don't need yet another concern to get these things, these vehicles out. But I claim that this has to change. And my not so bold prediction is that competence in cybersecurity for vehicles is something that it's already highly relevant, and it will become even more so in the years to come. So, okay, with that, let's get into the how. And I'll start by introducing some concepts, some words, basically, that we will use throughout the presentation. There are lots of ISO-defined words. We need a few of these. We need to understand what they mean. And then I will go through the TARA on a high level, from a helicopter perspective. And after that, I will exemplify trying to make it concrete, so we really understand how all these sort of dots fit together, and related to things that are not sort of outside TARA but related to TARA. So with that, let's start with some terminology which we will need. As I said, there are a few words that we will use throughout, and they are, maybe some of them at least, a bit non-intuitive. One word is item. It's a completely neutral word, but it's defined as a component or set of components that carries out some function on the vehicle level. I think it's helpful to think of this as a subsystem. Okay, so try to think of it as now as a subsystem. When we get into the showing the process, I think it will be quite clear what an item is. As I said, I'll show you an example. The other word, which is a bit strange, is the word asset. And An asset is defined as an object that has value or contributes to value. That doesn't really say very much, because that's more or less the dictionary definition of the word. But when we talk about value here, we mean value in terms of cybersecurity information. And cybersecurity information is the classic triad in cybersecurity, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So one or more of those things, that's what has value. So that is the asset that we need to protect. Okay, then there are three things that are, well, the things that we want to sort of relate in the TARA. It's a threat scenario, which is a potential cause of a compromise of this cybersecurity information that we just mentioned. It's attack path. It's more or less synonymous, I think, with the word attack vector, which might be more commonly used, which is how to realize a threat scenario. And then it's a damage scenario. And damage here means anything that can happen that you don't want to happen. They use the word adverse consequence. So it doesn't have to mean that somebody gets hurt. It just means something happened that was not desirable, involving a vehicle or vehicle function then. And I think that the meaning of these words will be clear as we get into the actual the actual process of the TARA. I'll be using a specific example throughout. I've stolen this directly from one of the appendices in the standard. It's a headlamp system, and I have my pointer here. So the item, which is what we are doing the TARA analysis on, is everything inside this white box. Consists of a headlamp switch, which is what the driver controls. It's connected to a body control ECU, and then there's a CAN bus down to a power switch actuator controlling the lamps, which are here. There's also a camera ECU inside this item. It's connected to gateway ECU outside of the item. There's an OBD connector here. There's probably dozens of other ECUs here to the left. And then more interestingly, there are some external interfaces. There's a cellular interface and there's a Bluetooth interface connecting to the navigation ECU. And this is what they refer to as the operational environment. So this was the item. We talked about the asset. You could probably find more assets here, but we will be looking at this CAN bus, and we will talk about the integrity of signals on this CAN bus. So remember, CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. So the integrity of the signals on the CAN bus, that has obvious value, right? That is our asset. That we will look at. So try to keep this picture in mind. We will actually come back to it a couple of times to remind ourselves. But the important thing, if any attribute is compromised, such as the integrity of the signals on the CAN bus, it could lead to a damage scenario. Okay, so before we actually do the TARA, we have to define and specify what are we doing the TARA on. And the thing we are doing a TARA on is our item. Once again, synonymous with maybe subsystem is useful to have as a cue. We need to define that item in terms of what functions it performs, what the item boundary is, and how it sort of relates to the rest of the system. So what one maybe could call architectural aspects of the item. a good question to ask here would maybe be, how do I know that an item is relevant to do a TARA on? In other words, has cybersecurity relevance? I won't go into that, but there are guidelines for this in the appendix of the standard. You basically have to ask yourself some key questions, whether or to what extent it's connected, for instance, if it's involved in anything that has to do with safety and so on. If any of these are answered by yes, then the rule is it has cybersecurity relevance. Okay, so now brace yourselves, because here comes sort of the whole TARA, or all the steps in the TARA. In this picture. Okay, we have our item. This is not a part of the TARA, but it's something, of course, we have to do as a preliminary step. Now, we define our assets. That's the first thing we do. And once again, we refer to this example with the integrity of the signals on the canvas. That is an example of an asset, something worth protecting. Maybe one could mention that it's not for this item, but in some other parts of the car, maybe you have RSA encryption keys stored somewhere. You don't want the confidentiality of those keys to be compromised. So in that case, it's the C of the CIA. That would also be an asset. For a completely different item, but nevertheless. Okay, now that we have our assets and an example of that, the next question could be, what are some damage scenarios that one could sort of envision if such an asset was compromised? And an example could be that the headlamp maybe turns off in the middle of the night while you're out driving, leading to a collision with a tree, maybe, or some other immovable object. That could be a consequence of the integrity of the signal down to the actuator being compromised. Another example could be that the camera ECU, if you recall, there was a camera ECU in the item, which should then detect oncoming traffic and automatically switch to low beam. Maybe this one doesn't work or doesn't send the right signal down because, once again, the integrity is compromised. So it doesn't switch to low beam. That could be another damage scenario. When you have all your damage scenarios that you can think of, you have to rate them in terms of impact. So this step is called impact rating. And we will get back to the details here. Actually, one should say also here that before you do the impact rating, you categorize the damage scenarios. There are 4 different types of categories. There is safety, which is sort of the obvious one, something that is dangerous. There is financial, there is personal, and there is operational. We won't go into those so much, but once you have categorized your damage scenario, it is much easier to sort of ask the right questions as to what the impact is. That's the important part. You can't really compare a safety issue like a front collision with like a lamp that doesn't work, or the parking lights doesn't work, for instance. Those are completely different things. Anyway, the next step could be then to ask what is the cause of these damage scenarios? And these are your threat scenarios, simply. So what could compromise the integrity of the signal on the CAN bus? On sort of a high level, no details given, somebody succeeded in spoofing a signal on the CAN bus somehow. You don't have to say much more details than that, but that could be an example. Possibly turning the headlamp off. And then finally, having your threat scenarios, you ask how, in detail now, how can this threat, for each one of them, if you have more than one, how are these threats, how can they be accomplished in more detail? And then the last important step of that part is to rate the feasibility. So what does feasibility mean? It means how hard or easy is it to perform such an attack? And hard, easy are obviously very sort of fluffy concepts, so we have to be more specific than that. But we will come back to that in the example, what we mean by, or how to judge hard and easy. So, okay, having done the impact rating of our damage scenarios and having rated the feasibility of our attack paths, we basically combine the impact rating and the feasibility rating, and we get a risk value. And that is the most important outcome of the TARA. It's a number between 1 and 5. To sort of show the very last part and see how it relates to the rest of the standard now. Once you have your risk value, that is your guide to making what they call the risk treatment options. So we have to decide what to do now. Should we retain the risk? Maybe you got a low risk value, then maybe you decide to retain it. Or maybe you decide to share it with a subcontractor that makes part of your item. If you do that, that's fine. Then you have something called a cybersecurity claim. You claim something. If you instead conclude that we need to reduce the risk or remove the risk altogether, that would be called a cybersecurity goal. And a cybersecurity goal is much like sort of a high-level requirement, one could say. And high-level requirements are, as always, they're broken down to lower-level requirements, which are allocated on our components and items and so on and so forth. And they must be they must be verified for completeness and correctness and consistency and so on. So they are, so to speak, what one would call useful requirements. Note, though, that this whole part to the right here is not part of the TARA. The only thing that is TARA here is this middle part. It ends with making a decision to avoid, reduce, share, or retain. But I just wanted to show the connection to the to other parts of the ISO standard. Okay, that was basically sort of a helicopter view of the TARA process. We can quickly revisit our headlamp example now. What I will do now is to sort of go through an example where we specify damage scenarios, threat scenarios, and attack paths, and see what one would actually do. This example, one could say, is maybe a bit contrived and simplified. That's maybe true, but it's not really important because its whole purpose is really just to exemplify and illustrate the how the process is carried out. So how to think. And how to think is what we will get into here. So starting in the middle then. A good question to ask is, what can happen? And what can happen is really your threat scenarios in technical terms, as related to an item. Once again, for example, the integrity of the signals on the canvas could be compromised. And there could be more threats. All threats you can think of should be listed and enumerated. And then the next question is, okay, what could that lead to? What could be the consequences of such a threat? This will be your damage scenarios. Note that there could be more damage scenarios for one threat. Certainly. And as I said earlier, these damage scenarios should be rated, and prior to rating them for impact, they should be categorized as to what kind of damage we're talking about. And then finally, you go to the other side and you ask, how sort of in detail can this threat be realized? So how can this happen? And this is your attack paths. And there could probably be several. This is a copy of an example from the standard, which sort of then shows that we take the impact rating of the damage scenarios. There's a 4-step. There's 4 steps in that rating, and we take the feasibility of the attack paths from, well, the rating is from very low to high. Note that this is a bit confusing because high here means easy, basically. Something that is easy to do, meaning high risk. Very low means very difficult to do. Also, a very important point to make now is actually that you don't have to do this in any particular order. You can start wherever you like. You can start with the damage scenario, threat scenario, attack path, whatever you wish. The only thing that's important is that you relate all these 3 things to each other. And in reality, you would probably jump back and forth. You would start somewhere, find a damage scenario, find an attack path, and then maybe you thought of yet another attack path leading to another threat scenario, giving rise to new damage scenarios, and so on. So there's no like algorithm to follow in that sense. Okay, let's take a specific example, and let's just start with the damage scenario and a couple of examples of such. So once again, the example that we're using is for the data communication, the lamp request signals down to this actuator that controls the lamps. It's the integrity of those signals which is our asset. That's what we need to protect, and that's what we're worried about. What could be some possible damages that one could think of? And as I mentioned earlier, sort of a dramatic one is a front collision because the headlamp suddenly turns off in the middle of the night while I'm out driving on a dark road. Another one would be, for instance, that I go out to dry my car. It's parked in the garage, and when I come out, the lamps won't turn on. I don't have any headlamps. I probably won't drive then, hopefully. And you could probably think of more. Okay, then we should first categorize these. What categories of damages are these? Well, the first one, a front collision with, for instance, a tree, is definitely of type safety. Somebody can get seriously hurt here. Once we have the category, the sort of the check questions in the appendix will guide you to how to consider this from negligible to severe. This would certainly be severe. And here's a tricky little thing, because we need to map this to a numerical value. And you choose this number. Here I've used the number 2. Doesn't really matter. We will, at the end of this process, we'll try to summarize the only constraint there is. But let's use the number 2 for now, meaning severe. The other damage scenario, I cannot drive my car at night because the headlamps doesn't work. It's a type, what? Operational. Some function that should work doesn't work. So that's an operational issue. And we rate this to be major and then map it to a slightly smaller numerical value. Okay, now we have those two and we have rated them. Now, identify threat scenarios. And let's just focus on the first damage scenario to sort of keep the space of all possible options down here. What is the cause for damage scenario 1? What could be a possible cause? So somebody could somehow be spoofing a lamp request signal. Once again, there's not very much detail in that statement, but if somebody could spoof signals on the CAN bus, sending down a signal which tells the actuator to turn the lamp on or off, that is one possible threat. Another threat is if somebody has been tampering with the signals from the body control ECU, so that when you want to control your lamps, instead of doing what it should be doing, the lamp possibly turns off. So if you have spoofing, you have tampering. Okay, what was the next step? It was the attack paths, right? And let's just look here again. So 2 possible attack paths is, one is via the cellular interface, which all modern cars have. Somebody succeeds in injecting a malicious control signal through this interface. The navigation ECU passes this forward to the gateway ECU and down onto the CAN bus, turning the lamps off. That was our first damage scenario. Another attack path which is possible to imagine is that somebody gets access to the OBD connector, sends a malicious control signal through the gateway ECU down to the CAN bus again, and the lamp turns off. This is just the wording for what I just said. So one is a remote attack path via the cellular interface, spoofing the lamp request off, because that's our damage scenario, right? And the other one is requires local access to the OBD connector. Might be a bit strange to think of actually this second one in terms of crashing into a tree, because I wouldn't want to be sitting in the car and having control of the OBD connector. But you can maybe imagine that somebody has an OBD connector connected to a Bluetooth device, for instance. Then you could actually remotely control possibly the lamps. But those are two examples of attack paths, and here is basically everything summarized now. We just focus on damage scenario 1, threat scenario 1, and our 2 attack paths. So the last step was, for each attack path we have to rate the feasibility, and the feasibility means how hard or how easy is it to carry out this attack. There are different ways of doing this. There's not like one correct way. The way in this example, it's using something called attack potential. An attack potential considers a few things. It considers elapsed time. So like how long would it actually require to perform such an attack? It considers specialist expertise. You have to have like detailed knowledge of the ECUs or how CAN works and whatnot. Knowledge of the item that you are compromising. Window of opportunity, and like if there's any special equipment involved. So it's sort of a weighting of a number of different factors which has relevance for when we use the word feasibility. So let's look at the first attack path. It was the cellular remote approach. There, without going through the details, the conclusion is this is low effort, meaning high risk. And maybe it's not so low effort, but here you would actually also weigh in the fact that this can be done remotely. And who is connected to the internet? Everyone. So the attack surface or the number of potential attackers is huge. And that is something, and it doesn't really require any or very much like special equipment and so on. And we map also this to number. We take the magic number 2 in this case. The other attack path, which was via the OBD connector, deemed to be high effort, in other words, lower risk. For instance, you need to have some special equipment for the OBD connector. You need physical access to the car. You probably need to be inside the car, and so on. So you get a lower risk for that. And finally, then, okay, let's try to summarize everything here. Damage scenario number 1. We said severe. It's the highest impact rating. And we said the number 2. We should combine that with, let's take the worst attack path with the highest risk. We said feasibility rating 2. You combine these to get your risk value. And you could really, in some sense, do this any way you like. But the big constraint is that the risk value in the end must be a number between 1 and 5, where 5 is maximum risk. So this is just an example where you basically just take the product of impact and feasibility. So 2 times 2 is 4, and then you add 1, and then you get a risk of 5, which is a maximum risk. You could use any other numbers you like, but in the end you have to map the combination of these 2 things down to risk value, which maps to from 1 to 5. Or you could basically just make your own matrix here, your own table. That's not stipulated exactly how to do that. The point to make is that you have to do everything in a consistent and systematic way. That's what sort of gives you credibility in the analysis. Let's see if there's any more I should say about that. Yeah, okay, we talked about there are different ways to do or to analyze feasibility. This was called attack potential. There is also something called common vulnerability scoring system, which is not so uncommon in cybersecurity circles. It uses other sort of words to or other aspects to weigh in the feasibility analysis. And there's also something called an attack vector based approach, which more judges how close or how far away you are from your target. And guidelines for this and examples for this are found in the appendix. Also, maybe it's worth saying that what do you do if, I mean, in this case, there are 2 attack paths for one threat scenario, right? It's the threat scenario, by the way, that you allocate the risk to. But here you had another attack path for the same threat scenario. Well, a lower feasibility. You can do the same thing and you get a lower risk. Obviously, 2 times 1 is 2 plus 1 is 3, so you get a lower risk. That makes sense. You would probably focus on the risk with the highest value to begin with, and maybe make a claim for the other one, or you actually conclude that both of them has to be managed and would result in a cybersecurity goal. Okay, let's try to, with sort of a different or alternative view, summarize everything and zoom out again. How are we doing on time, by the way?
12:10.
We have 20 more minutes. I think we're in good shape then. Okay, item definition, that's what we started with. That is just the thing we are doing our TARA on. It's a preliminary step before starting our TARA. And then the TARA starts with identifying our assets. And once again, what are assets? Assets are things that has value. And value, the word value here means value in terms of either confidentiality, integrity, or availability. That's like the golden triad of cybersecurity. And once again, item is like a subsystem. Maybe it's an ECU or some function. These words are sort of used differently in different companies. So I think that's why they chose the neutral word item. Okay. When you have your asset or your assets, you sort of connect the dots between these three things: attack paths, threat scenarios, and damage scenarios. And as I said earlier, you can do this in any order you like, until you're convinced that you have covered everything. In damage scenarios, they can be of different type, we said. There can be different types of consequences. Safety was the example that we used. It could be financial. It could be operations. In other words, something doesn't work as it's supposed to work. Or it could be a privacy issue. Typically, maybe your credit card number got leaked or something like that. And then your threat scenarios, we mentioned some examples. We talked about spoofing of signals on the CAN bus, but it could also be something like RSA keys that are compromised or something. In the end, you take the rating of the damage scenarios, here called impact rating, give it a numerical value. You take the attack paths, give it a feasibility rating, also a numerical value, and you combine these and get your risk value, which is a number between 1 and 5, where 1 is minimal risk. And then that risk value will guide you as to what or how to select your risk treatment options, which is the last step of the TARA. Share or retain risk. If so, you have a cybersecurity claim, or reduce or avoid risk, in which case you have a cybersecurity goal. Okay, that was the how. I think, or I hope, that made it clear. We're almost done now. I'll say some final words before we see if there are any questions. Okay. In general, it's something to be aware of is that cybersecurity aspects is not something you can add on afterwards. It must be an integral part of the product development process. And this is sort of an obvious statement, and it's something that everybody who has been involved with functional safety has heard before. You can't do it afterwards, or you can, but it will be very painful and not smart. And cybersecurity is also something that must be managed throughout the product lifecycle of the vehicle. It's not like you do your TARA, get your risk values, make your goals, break them down, allocate them to items, and then you're done, because you're not. 3 years down the road, maybe a new attack path is possible, which means that you have to revisit your TARA. Excuse me, and ensure that it is still sort of valid. It must be verified and documented and revisited throughout the life cycle of the product. Also, if you make a claim, that meant that you chose to actually retain the risk, right? You said that, well, the risk is low, we'll live with it, or maybe you share it with a sub-supplier or something. This is also something that you cannot forget about. You have to reassess this during the life cycle of the vehicle. And all of these things are actually what the ISO standard is about, among other things. And it's also it's all sort of captured in the word cybersecurity management system. How to manage cybersecurity threats throughout the life cycle. So these are all arguments for why it's sensible to do this. But if you want to listen to that, you actually have to do this anyway, because now there are UN regulations, and regulations is something else than ISO standards. Regulations you actually have to follow. There are 2 UN regulations. UNECE means the European or Economic Commission for Europe, it means. There are 2 such regulations, 155 and 156. One is for cybersecurity management systems, and the other one is for software update management systems. These regulations have now, last time I checked, been ratified by 54 countries. So obviously the EU, Japan, South Korea, and a bunch of other countries. So if you want to sell your car in these countries, you have to comply with these regulations. There will be an audit, there will be an approval, there will be marking on the vehicle that will clearly show whether you are approved or not. But the interesting thing is that these documents are really, really short. They're, I don't think, 30, 40 pages maybe. They don't really tell you how to do this. So the thing is that, for instance, to comply with 155, if you actually go through 21434 and implement the requirements in that ISO standard, you are in pretty good shape to be approved for this UN regulation. And then the same goes for this other software update management system. There's another ISO standard which is coming out soon for that. And these will actually be required by, I think, 2024 for all vehicles. So it's time to wake up. Okay, that was the last thing I wanted to say. So let's turn to the Q&A and see if there's any questions?
No questions so far.
Okay.
But if you have questions, just write them down in the question section or the chat.
Yeah, you can write it. Yeah, now we're looking at another camera. Yeah, if you have any questions, if anything was unclear or whatever, you can write the questions in the chat. A recording of this webinar will be available on Ictech's YouTube channel.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So you can also post these questions later, and I will check in and see if anything new has come up, and I'll try to respond as best as I can. Also, if you have or if you want to have access to this material, to this presentation, just send me an email. My address is here. And then I'll send it to you. Okay.
Yeah, and in the future we are going to have some more webinars. After summer, our human factors specialist is going to have a webinar. So just check out our social media channels on LinkedIn and Instagram, and you will have the information about that. Yeah,
okay.
Perfect.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks for attending, and goodbye.
Bye.